So failover cluster has been installed on both these servers. I have logged in on both these servers, SQL Server 1P. Now let's see if failover cluster is configured properly. So failover cluster manager, we have to open failover cluster manager on both these servers, SQL Server 1P and 1S. Failover cluster manager. Once the failover cluster manager is opened, then we have to validate the cluster. So let's do all these things from 1P server. It's better, there is no good practice, we can use any of the server, but let's do it from 1P. So click on the failover cluster manager and click on validate the cluster, and here we have to add both the instance names SQL server 1p dot so we have to add both the servers and then run the validation test. So 1p is added. Now let's add SQL server 1s dot add verifying the server setting. So both the servers are added. Now let's try to run the test. Run all the test. Next, next. Let's wait for this test to complete. It will take some time. So let me pause the video for that. So now our test has ran successfully. Let's check the report once. Since all the fields are successful, create the cluster now using the validated nodes and click on finish. Click on next. Now the cluster name should be the same what we have created the cluster computer object. So the cluster computer object was AWS AON cluster. Now let's give the same name over here, AWS AON cluster. Hit next. We don't have any eligible storage that we have to add, and click on next. So once this get completed, then we will have Windows clustering configured between 1P and 1S. So the last step will be to configure the always on. So let's wait for some time to get this Windows clustering completed. So Windows clustering is completed. We can see it in the report that gets generated. And if we click on finish, and we can see Windows cluster. There is no role added as such, but we have both the nodes up and running. One vote has been assigned. Current vote is 1 on 1P because this is an active node, and current vote on 1S is 0. Assigned vote is 1 and 1. So both the nodes are added into the Windows cluster successfully. So now let's start with configuring SQL Server always on. Let's open SQL Server Management Studio and try to connect with our instance. SQL Server Management Studio, and we also have to open SQL Server Configuration Manager. Config. And same we can see on the 1S instance also. On the 1S instance, if we see, it should be connecting with. So let's connect the cluster. See, Windows cluster is configured. Role we don't have. Nodes 1P has current port as 1. So 1P is acting as primary and 1S is acting as secondary. Now let's open Management Studio on this server as well. And we also have to open SQL Server Configuration Manager. Configuration Manager. So this is the SQL Server Configuration Manager. In the Configuration Manager, we can see all the services are up and running except SQL Agent services. Let's start this service as well. Let's start the browsing service. It's not needed. It's not needed. So let's leave this as of now. SQL browser service is used to connect with for the named instance. If we have any other instance installed on the server, so in order to connect with the named instance on a port, we need SQL Server browser services up and running. As of now on this server, we have only default SQL instance installed. So let's go to the properties section of SQL services. We have these all services installed on this server. So let me walk you through all the services. So SQL Server Full Text Daemon, SQL Server MS SQL, SQL Server Agent Service Analysis, Browser, Integration, and Launchpad. So we have to go to SQL Server Service, go to Properties, and go to Always On and enable Always On. This can only be enabled once you have Windows Failover cluster installed on the server. You cannot enable this without enabling Windows cluster, without configuring Windows cluster actually. So click OK and then go and restart the service once. So once this is done on 1S, let's go and do the same step on 1P as well. On the 1P instance, let's go to services, and here also the agent service is down. Let's try to start the agent service. Go on to SQL Server, Properties, Enable. So SQL Server Always On is configured. Now let's try to connect with this instance. That if we try to expand Always On, it should be configured. So, and same should be for 1S as well. So if we try to, services are started, let's try to connect with our 1S instance. And as you can see, when we expand the Always On, it's expandable. So Always On has been initiated on these servers. Now let's try to configure Always On these servers. So 1P, and let's try to create a database. We can use SQL queries to create the database. That's much easy. Click on new query and create database AWS AON. Semicolon, run this command. And then let's try to create some table on this. Use AWS AON, and let's try to create a table. So here I am creating a table named product, which has product name and price. So let's try to create the table and insert some values in it. So here we are inserting 4 values or 5 values in the table. Now let's try to select all the objects from product table. Start from product. So we can see 5 objects over here. Now the prerequisite, if we refresh over here, we can see the database. Now the prerequisite for creating a data for configuring a database into a always on configuration is, first one is it should be in full recovery model. So let's try to check the recovery model. In the options you will see the recovery model is full. That's good. Now let's try to take backups. So the second prerequisite, it should have at least one full backup and at least one transactional log backup. So let's try to take the backup. C drive program files, SQL Server always on. Let's click on backup. The backup is taken, and task backup. This should be a transactional backup. Add. Let's try to give another name. AWS AON T.trn. Remove the BK part and TRN. Okay, transaction log backup is also taken. Now let's copy those 2 backups from our primary server to the secondary server and restore it on the secondary server. C drive, program files, SQL Server. And we have it in MS SQL Server. Here are the 2 backups. Let's copy it on our desktop first. Then let's try to move it on 1S. So on 1S also, let's move it on our desktop first. Then try to copy it on C drive. Or we can create one folder over here and try to restore the backups from this folder. Click on restore database. Click on device, select a device, add a file.